She married a Ferryman in threadbare clothes. He held the note on half the county. The rope came off the post at first light, and I pulled us across like I'd done every morning for 11 years, hand over hand, the current pushing at the hull, the ferry logging low and steady under the weight of Gideon Marsh's wagon. He was hauling timber south to the mill. Didn't say a word to me. Didn't look at me. Just sat up on the board with his hat pulled and watched the far bank come toward him. When we touched gravel, he clicked his team forward and rolled off without so much as a nod. His boy dropped the coins in the can on the post and ran after him. I didn't mind. I hadn't minded for years. The river was the Snake, just below where Millhaven Creek fed in from the north. The crossing was mine, the flat-bottomed ferry, the rope system, the small stone house on the east bank where I'd lived since I was 26. I was 41 that spring. My hands were scarred from the rope and calloused at the base of every finger, and I wore the same 2 coats I'd worn for the better part of a decade, depending on the weather. The brown canvas one for working, the gray wool one when I went to town. The gray one had a fraying cuff. I knew it. I left it that way. What men see they talk about. What they don't see they don't. I'd come to that crossing with $400 and a clear head. By the time Clara Voss stepped off the eastbound stage with 1 trunk and a boy of 9, I had accumulated quietly, without noise or ceremony, notes on 43 parcels of land stretching from Millhaven in the north to the river bend 7 miles south. Not all of it worth holding. Some of it worth a great deal. The Harker family had borrowed against their eastern quarter twice, good bottomland, flood plain, rich as anywhere in the territory, and they were behind. The Duvin brothers had borrowed against their mill operation and used the money for cattle that died in the '81 freeze. 3 other parcels were held simply as investment, purchased from men leaving the territory after bad years, purchased at a price they'd offered and I'd accepted without negotiating down further than was necessary. I wasn't cruel about it. I was patient. None of that was visible from the ferry rope. Clara Voss arrived in May. The stage stopped at the East Bank post because Donahue's store was there, and half the county's mail still came through Donahue's. I watched her step down. She was a small woman, dark-haired, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to women who have handled things alone for a long time. The boy, Thomas, I'd learned, carried his own bag and didn't complain about the weight. She asked Donahue something, and he pointed south down the road. She thanked him and gathered her trunk, and didn't look to see if anyone would help her with it. I helped her with it. She looked at me straight, dark eyes not unfriendly, not warm. "Thank you," she said. "Where are you headed?" "Duvins, I've taken a position." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then, housekeeping. Cooking for the brothers and their crew. I carried the trunk to the road and set it down. She thanked me again, shorter this time, and started south with the boy beside her. I watched them go, then went back to the ferry. The Duvin brothers were behind on their note by that point. I hadn't moved on it because I didn't want the mill, I wanted the money, and given enough time they'd find it or sell to someone who had it. But I knew the Duvin place. I'd been out there twice on business. It was a rough camp. The brothers were decent enough men, honest enough, but they drank in the evenings, and there was always a crew of river workers, and the bunkhouse was 30 yards from the main house. That was none of my business. But I thought about it. 3 weeks later, I crossed paths with Clara Voss at Donahue's on a Saturday. She was buying flour and a small amount of salt pork. Thomas was with her, looking at a display of hunting knives in a case. He had the look of a boy who understood he couldn't have one and was studying it anyway, out of something like respect for the thing itself. I bought what I'd come for and was at the door when she said, behind me, "You're the Ferryman." "I am. Thomas wants to know if he can watch sometime." "The crossing." She said it plainly, no apology in it. "He's interested in how the rope system works." "He's welcome any time." She nodded. "That's kind." We walked out at the same time. The day was bright, a west wind off the hills. She was carrying the flour sack and I took it from her without asking, which was perhaps presumptuous, but she didn't object. We walked to the road together and I set it in her wagon. "How is the Duvin place?" I asked. She looked at me a moment, then "It's work." That was all. She climbed up, gathered the lines, clicked the horse forward. Thomas watched me from the seat with those quiet eyes. He came to the ferry the following Tuesday, stood on the east bank and watched 3 crossings before he said a word. Then he asked me about the rope tension and whether the angle mattered depending on the current and how I'd set the anchorage points. Good questions. Better than most grown men would have asked. I answered them straight, and he listened without nodding along the way boys do when they're pretending to follow. He was actually following. He came back on Thursday, then the following week. We didn't talk much beyond the mechanics of things. He was comfortable in silence, which his mother had either taught him or which he'd come by honestly on his own. By July, I'd begun to understand that Clara Voss was the kind of woman who could exist in a rough place without becoming diminished by it, but that she would not stay in it unless she had to. She had pride. Not the prickly kind, not the kind that makes a person brittle, the quiet kind, the kind that just refuses certain things without making an announcement. She was making do at Duvin's. She was not at ease there. I invited her for a Sunday meal in late July. I cooked elk and cornbread and a pot of beans that I'd had working since Friday. She brought a pie. We ate at the table outside by the river because the evening was warm and the light was good. Thomas went and sat at the ferry and watched the water, which was his way. We talked for a long time. About the territory, about where she'd come from, Missouri, a farm, a husband who died of fever 3 years back, about the land, about Thomas. She didn't talk about herself with any particular need to be known. She talked the way you talk when you've been in your own company for a long time and someone's company turns out to be decent, and you find it's not uncomfortable, like putting something down you've been carrying. I was not a man who'd spent much time in women's company, not because I'd avoided it but because I'd been busy, and because the work of a ferryman is solitary by nature, and because I had not, in the years of building what I was building, wanted to put a woman in the position of marrying a threadbare man on a river. I was willing to wait. I had patience for most things. After she left, I sat by the water for an hour and admitted to myself that I was not going to be patient about this. I courted her honestly. Slowly, because she was careful and I respected that, but without any disguise about my intentions. I helped with things at Duvin's when help was needed, a wagon wheel, a fence section, a roof patch after a hailstorm. I brought Thomas a surveyor's chain that was mine spare and showed him how to use it. I sent over good cuts of meat twice when I'd traded for more than I needed. None of it was calculated beyond the simple calculation of a man who wants a woman to know he's a steady and useful person. What I didn't do was tell her about the notes. This was not deception. I want to be clear about that, or as clear as a man can be when he's looking back at something he did. I didn't lie. I didn't misrepresent. I wore my canvas coat and my gray wool coat, and I pulled the rope every morning, and I collected coins in the can on the post, and that was what she saw. But I did not say. I also hold paper on 43 parcels of land, and I have more money in a St. Louis account than the Duvin brothers will see in their lives combined. I didn't say it because I'd spent 15 years learning that what a man possesses changes how people treat him, and I had no interest in being wanted for what I'd accumulated. I wanted to know she wanted me. The man, the ferry rope, the fraying cuff. In September, she left Duvin's. One of the river crew had said something to her that she told me only in the vaguest terms and didn't need to say in full for me to understand. She'd packed their things that same day. She had a small amount saved, and she took a room above Donahue's store and asked if there was work to be had in the county. I asked her to marry me 3 days later. She was quiet for a long while. We were standing outside Donahue's in the early evening, the street empty, a horse tied at the rail up the block. She looked at me with an expression I can't put a clean name to. It was considering, but not calculating, measuring something. "You don't have much," she said. "Not mean about it, just the fact. I have the ferry, the house, I'm steady." She looked at me for another moment. "I know you are," she said, then, "all right." We married in October at the small church at Millhaven. The preacher and Donahue and his wife and Thomas and nobody else. She wore a blue dress she'd had since Missouri. I wore the gray coat with the fraying cuff. Thomas shook my hand afterward with both of his. She moved into the stone house, and that first week she cleaned it so thoroughly that I couldn't find 3 things I'd owned for years and had to ask where they'd gone, which made her laugh. The first real laugh I'd heard from her, short and surprised, like she'd caught herself at it. I liked it very much. Thomas set up a system for measuring the river's rise and fall with notches cut into a fence post at the bank, which was his own idea, and accurate to within an inch. The notes came up 6 weeks into the marriage. It was not how I'd planned to tell her, if I'd planned to tell her at all. Harker's eldest son came to the house looking for me, hat in hand, wanting to discuss the note on their eastern quarter before I moved on it. He was respectful about it. He called me Mr. Combe, which was my name, which men didn't often use because they'd gotten used to just calling me the Ferryman. He sat at my table and laid out what they could manage and what they couldn't, and asked if there was any flexibility. Clara was at the stove. She didn't turn around while he talked, but she went still. After Harker's son left, we'd worked something out that suited both sides. I wasn't interested in the land itself, only the return. She stood at the counter for a moment with her back to me. Then she turned around. "How many are there?" she said, not a question. More like a person, establishing a fact they already half knew. 43 parcels, though 3 of those are. "How much land?" I told her. She looked at me for a long time. Her face was not angry. It was something more careful than that, more searching. "You let me feel sorry for you," she said. "I never asked for that. You let me think I was marrying a ferryman with a rope and a stone house. You did, that's what I am. It isn't all you are." "No," I said, "but it's what I wanted you to see first." She was quiet. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me in front of Donahue's store when I'd asked her to marry me, that same measuring, searching for something. "Why?" she said. I sat down at the table and turned my coffee cup in my hands. The cup was old, chipped on one side, and I'd kept it because I'd had it since the first year on the river, and I was attached to it the way you get attached to plain things that were with you when you were building. "I spent a long time accumulating things," I said. "Land, money, paper with names on it. And I noticed that when men knew what I had, they wanted something from me, or they didn't like that I had it, or they treated me different than they would have otherwise." I looked at the cup. "I'd rather be known first, before any of that." She didn't say anything. "When you agreed to marry me," I said, "you thought I had a ferry and a coat with a bad cuff. You knew that, and you said all right anyway." The silence ran long. Outside I could hear Thomas at the river, his boots on the gravel. Clara came to the table and sat down across from me. She set her hands on the table flat and looked at them for a moment, then looked up at me. "I'm not angry," she said. "I know. I want to be. I've been working out whether I should be." "That's fair. But I think," she stopped, started again. "I think the ferryman is a good man, and I think I married the ferryman whatever else you are." She looked at me steadily. "I want you to understand that I would have said the same thing in front of Donahue's store if you had nothing at all. I need you to know that." I looked at her. "I know," I said. "That's why I asked." She held my eyes a moment longer. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, just covered it, the way you'd hold something still. Her hand was warm and dry and certain, and she didn't say anything else, just kept it there, and I turned my hand under hers and held it. That was the whole of it, no speech, no ceremony. Outside, Thomas was calling something about the river level. His voice had the particular flat excitement of a boy who's discovered his measurements were right. We went to see. In the years after, I wore the gray coat less. Not because I'd bought a better one, I had, eventually, when Clara put her foot down about the cuff, but because I didn't need it the same way. The ferry was still mine and I ran it myself most mornings. The rope had been replaced twice. Thomas learned to work the system well enough that I could leave him to it some days. And by the time he was 17, he could read the current as well as I could. The Duvin brothers sold the mill to a man from Portland, paid off their note, and left the territory. The Harker family kept the bottomland. I eventually sold most of the other parcels, not all at once, and put the money to better use in a bank in St. Louis where it would work without my having to think about it much. I didn't need the county to know what I had. The county didn't need to know. What the county knew was that Combe ran the ferry, and that his wife was a dark-haired woman from Missouri who didn't talk much, but when she did you listened, and that they had a boy who'd grown into a surveyor and who knew that river better than anyone. What I knew was the rest. On a morning in the third year, Clara came down to the bank before I pushed off. It was early spring, the river high and fast, the morning cold and gray and clean. She stood on the gravel in her coat and watched me set the rope for the first crossing, and she had the look she got sometimes, quiet and inward and fully present, both at once. When I came back on the return, she was still there. "You don't have to wait," I said. "I'm not waiting," she said. "I'm watching." I secured the ferry and she came and stood beside me, close, her shoulder at mine, looking at the river going past. The current moved steady and brown and without hurry. She slipped her hand into the crook of my arm and stayed there. I looked at the water. I had not imagined when I first set rope here at 26 that this would be part of it. The land I'd imagined. The notes and the patience and the slow accumulation that I'd been sure of in the way you're sure of things you're built for. But this. A woman beside me at the river on a cold morning, her hand in my arm, not needing to say anything. I'd been invisible a long time, chosen that. But invisible isn't the same as unseen, and I had spent enough years knowing the difference to understand what it meant that she was standing there. She'd come to me in threadbare clothes with a trunk and a boy and a face that didn't beg anything from anyone, and she'd looked at what I was, the rope, the coat, the coin kin on the post, and she'd said all right. That was all. That was the whole of it. And I held the note on half the county. She knew that now, and it hadn't moved her an inch, which told me what I'd needed to know from the beginning, and which I thought about sometimes on the water on a cold morning, the current going past, her hand in my arm. I thought about it then. I put my hand over hers on my arm, and the river kept moving, and that was enough.